2 anonymous letters. That's all it took. The first one cost my ex-boyfriend $45,000 in fines and forced him to tear down his illegal dream home. The second one, that brought the Australian tax office to his door with questions about 7 years of unreported income. By the time the dust settled, my revenge had cost him over $200,000, his new relationship, his business reputation, and the property he'd stolen our dreams to build. My name is Sarah, and this is the story of how my narcissistic ex made the most expensive mistake of his life, being cruel to the wrong woman. Let me take you back to where it all began. They say revenge is a dish best served cold. Well, mine was ice cold, methodically planned, and devastatingly expensive for the man who thought he could treat me like garbage and walk away unscathed. When I first met Jake, he seemed like everything I'd been looking for. Charismatic, confident, with big dreams about building a life together. He was a panel beater by trade, working in the gig economy, taking cash jobs here and there. At 51, he'd been around the block, knew how to charm people, and knew exactly what to say to make me feel special. We'd been together for 4 years when he showed me the property. 20 acres of raw land, nestled in the hills, surrounded by eucalyptus trees, an endless sky. "This is where we'll build our future," he told me, his arm around my shoulders as we stood on that dusty plot. Our forever home. I believed him. God, how I believed him. For 2 years, the property consumed our lives. Every weekend we'd drive out there with plans and dreams. I spent hours on Pinterest creating boards for our future home. We'd sit on camping chairs, drinking wine as the sun set, talking about the garden I'd plant, the workshop he'd build, maybe even some chickens. Jake had this grand vision. He didn't want to rent an industrial shed in town for his panel beating business anymore. Too expensive, he said. Too many overheads. Instead, he'd build a combination workshop and living space on the property. A big shed for his work, and a container home attached to it where we could live while we saved to build our dream house. "It'll save us thousands," he'd say. "We'll be mortgage-free, business expenses down, living our best life." I supported him completely. I even helped design the container home layout, picking out fixtures, planning the tiny kitchen, imagining our cozy life there. Sure, it wasn't the grand house we'd eventually build, but it was ours, a stepping stone to something bigger. What I didn't know then was that Jake had conveniently forgotten to mention one crucial detail to the council. He was building anything at all. Looking back, the signs were there. They always are, aren't they? But love makes you blind, and hope makes you stupid. Jake had always been a bit of a rule bender. He liked doing things his way, cutting corners, finding loopholes. "Why pay the government for permission to build on my own land?" he'd say. "It's my property. I should be able to do what I want." When I'd bring up permits and regulations, he'd wave me off. "That's for people who don't know what they're doing. I've been in construction-adjacent work for 30 years. I know what I'm doing. Besides, we're in the middle of nowhere. No one cares." But someone would care eventually. I just didn't know I'd be the one to make sure of it. The narcissism was harder to spot at first. It crept in slowly, like mold growing behind walls. First, it was small things. My opinions mattered less and less. Plans we'd made together would suddenly change to suit only him. When I'd object, he'd gaslight me. "We never said that," or "You're remembering it wrong." Then came the criticism. My clothes weren't right. I was gaining weight. I didn't understand business. I was too sensitive, too emotional, too dramatic. According to Jake, I was too everything except what he actually wanted. The emotional abuse escalated in year 3. He'd give me the silent treatment for days over perceived slights. He'd make plans without me, then act like I was crazy for feeling excluded. He'd flirt with other women right in front of me, then tell me I was jealous and insecure when I confronted him. But I stayed. Because we had those 20 acres, because we had plans, because leaving meant admitting I'd wasted 4 years of my life on a man who saw me as an accessory rather than a partner. Work on the property began in earnest about 8 months before our relationship ended. Jake threw himself into it with manic energy. Every spare moment, every dollar went into that build. He'd hired a few workers to help, all cash jobs, of course, and the structure was going up quickly. The shed came first, a massive steel structure where he'd house his panel beating equipment. Then the containers arrived, 2 of them, which would be modified and joined together to create our living space. It was actually coming together beautifully. Despite everything, I felt a surge of hope. Maybe once we moved in, things would get better. Maybe having our own space, away from the rental we shared in town, would bring us closer. But instead, Jake grew more distant. He'd spend entire weekends at the property, often not inviting me along. "There's nothing for you to do," he'd say. "It's just construction stuff. I'll bring you out when it's prettier." When I did visit, he'd be short with me, irritated by my presence. I felt like an intruder in the dream we'd built together. The container home I'd helped design was taking shape without my input. Choices I thought we'd make together, where to put windows, how to configure the space, were being made without me. I started to suspect there was someone else. Little things didn't add up. He'd be unavailable for hours, then give vague explanations about being in areas with no cell service. He'd started dressing better, wearing cologne more often. He'd password protected his phone, something he'd never done before. When I'd bring up my concerns, he'd explode. I was paranoid. I was suffocating him. I was ruining everything with my jealousy and insecurity. Classic narcissist playbook: make the victim doubt their own reality. The end came on a Saturday in February. I'd driven out to the property uninvited, determined to see what was going on. When I arrived, I found Jake with a woman. They were inside the nearly complete container home, laughing, comfortable, intimate in a way that made my stomach drop. Her name was Jade. She was 34, blonde, bubbly, and clearly very familiar with my boyfriend and our property. When I confronted them, Jake didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. "We need to talk," he said, ushering me outside while Jade stayed in what was supposed to be our home. He broke up with me in the dirt driveway of our dream property, told me it wasn't working, and he needed someone who understood him better. He actually had the audacity to say, "I hope we can still be friends." I was devastated, humiliated, rage-filled, and heartbroken all at once. 4 years. 4 years of my life, my dreams, my plans, all being erased as he stood there with his hands in his pockets, eager for me to leave so he could get back to his new girlfriend. "What about the property?" I asked, my voice shaking. "We planned this together." "It's in my name," he said with a shrug. "Always has been. You'll need to get your stuff out of the rental by the end of the month. I'm moving Jade in." That was it. 4 years dismissed with logistics and deadlines. No apology. No acknowledgement of what we'd built together. Just cold, calculated narcissism. I drove home in a daze, crying so hard I had to pull over twice. But somewhere between the property and my soon-to-be former home, the sadness began to crystallize into something else. Something harder and sharper. Anger. I spent the first week after the breakup in a fog. Friends rallied around me, offering support, wine, and promises that I was better off without him. They were right, of course, but it didn't make it hurt less. Then one night, unable to sleep, I started thinking about that property, about all the corners Jake had cut, about the permits he'd never pulled, about the septic system that was definitely not up to code, about the fact that he was running a business from a residential property in a bushfire-prone area. I started researching council regulations, building codes, permit requirements. What I found made my eyes widen. Jake had broken so many rules, I lost count. The structure he'd built required multiple permits he didn't have. Operating a business from that location without proper zoning was illegal. The area was designated as high bushfire risk, which meant even stricter building standards that he definitely hadn't met. The septic system, if you could even call it that, was a disaster waiting to happen. And then there was the tax situation. All those cash jobs, all that unreported income. Jake had been bragging for years about how he outsmarted the tax man. A plan began forming in my mind. It wasn't pretty, and it wasn't kind, but neither was what Jake had done to me. He'd used me, lied to me, replaced me, and expected to ride off into the sunset with his new girlfriend in the home we'd planned together, all while leaving me with nothing but hurt. Well, I was about to make that sunset significantly more expensive. I started with the council. I spent days crafting the perfect anonymous letter, typing it on a computer at the public library so it couldn't be traced to me. I made sure to mention every violation I could think of, framing myself as a concerned neighbor. The letter detailed the illegal structure, the unpermitted building works, the business being operated without proper commercial zoning, and the inadequate septic system. And then I added the masterstroke. I mentioned children living on the property. There weren't any children, of course. Jade didn't have kids, and neither did Jake. But I knew that mention of children in an unsafe, unpermitted structure would trigger an immediate investigation. Councils don't mess around when child safety is potentially at risk. I mailed the letter from 3 towns over using cash to buy the stamp. No traces, no evidence, just a concerned citizen doing their civic duty. Then I waited. It took 2 weeks for the council to act, but when they did, they came down hard. I heard about it through a mutual friend who'd run into Jake at the hardware store. He was furious, ranting about nosy neighbors and government overreach. The council had shown up unannounced, served him with a notice, and begun their investigation. They brought a building inspector, a septic specialist, and someone from the fire safety department. The property was in a designated bushfire zone, which meant Jake was supposed to have defensible space cleared, fire-resistant building materials, and proper emergency access. He had none of it. The inspector took photos, measurements, samples. They interviewed Jake, who apparently tried to charm his way out of it, then argue his way out of it, then finally just got angry and demanded they leave his property. That went about as well as you'd expect. 3 weeks later, Jake received the notices of violation. The penalties were even better than I'd hoped. $17,000 for occupying a building without an occupancy permit. The inspector had found evidence that Jake and Jade were already living in the container home, despite it having no legal approval for habitation. $28,000 for the unpermitted building works themselves. The shed, the container modifications, the electrical work, the plumbing, all of it done without proper permits or inspections. But wait, there was more. The council also issued an order requiring him to bring the entire structure up to code, which would cost tens of thousands more, or demolish it entirely. Given the location in a bushfire zone and the extent of the violations, bringing it up to code would likely be impossible. He was going to have to tear it down. I learned all this through the grapevine, and each new detail was like a gift. The property that was supposed to save him money was now bankrupting him. The dream that he'd stolen from me was turning into his nightmare. I remember the day I found out about the fines. I was at a coffee shop when a mutual acquaintance mentioned running into Jake. He was going on and on about some council inspector giving him grief, she said, rolling her eyes. Something about fines? He seemed really stressed. I nodded sympathetically, hiding the smile that threatened to break across my face. That's terrible, I said, stirring my coffee slowly. I hope he's okay. Inside, I was celebrating. Every single piece of information that filtered back to me was confirmation that my plan was working perfectly. Jake, who had always been so confident, so sure that he could bend the rules without consequence, was finally learning what it felt like to be powerless. but I wasn't done yet. While the council situation was unfolding, I'd been preparing phase 2 of my revenge, the Australian Taxation Office. Jake had been evading taxes for years. I knew this because he'd bragged about it constantly. The government gets enough of our money, he'd say, counting out cash payments from customers with a satisfied grin. What they don't know won't hurt them. He kept minimal records, reported only a fraction of his income, and took cash whenever possible to avoid leaving a paper trail. I'd always felt uncomfortable with it. Every time he'd laugh about outsmarting the tax office, something in my stomach would twist. But when I'd express concern, Jake would mock me for being too honest and a rule follower. He'd say I didn't understand business, that I was naive about how the real world worked. Well, this rule follower was about to cost him dearly. The thing is, I'd kept records over the years without really meaning to. It wasn't intentional at first, just the natural accumulation of a shared life. Photos on my phone showing completed jobs, Jake standing proudly beside freshly painted cars, text messages where he'd brag about landing a big cash job, screenshots of conversations where he'd mention specific amounts, even some invoices and receipts he'd left lying around our rental, showing the real scope of his business versus what I suspected he actually reported. During those weeks after the breakup, while I was researching council regulations, I'd also been going through my phone, my old emails, my photo gallery. I compiled everything into a detailed report. I included estimates of his actual income versus what he'd probably declared. I noted the pattern of cash transactions, the way he'd always insist on being paid in cash for certain jobs. I mentioned the business equipment that had appeared over the years, expensive tools, a new work van, industrial equipment, with no apparent legitimate explanation for how he'd afforded them on his reported income. I cross-referenced dates, made conservative estimates when I wasn't certain, and built a timeline of what looked like systematic tax evasion spanning years. Then I submitted it all to the ATO's tax evasion reporting line. Unlike the council letter, which had been brief and anonymous, this report was detailed, thorough, and impossible to ignore. I included every piece of documentation I had. I walked them through Jake's business model, his preference for cash, his bragging about avoiding taxes. I made it easy for them to investigate. And then I waited again. The ATO moves slowly, but when they move, they're thorough. It took about a month, but eventually Jake received the letter. I heard about it from the same mutual friend who'd told me about the council investigation. She called me, her voice concerned. "Have you heard from Jake lately?" she asked. "I ran into him at the shops and he looked awful. Apparently he's being audited by the tax office, like a serious audit." "Oh no," I said, my voice perfectly calibrated to sound concerned. "That sounds stressful." "Yeah, he seemed really paranoid about it. Kept saying someone must have reported him, that someone had it out for him." She paused. "You don't think, you guys broke up kind of recently?" "I've been trying to move on," I said honestly. "I haven't really thought about Jake much." That was a lie, but she didn't need to know that. "I hope it works out for him, though." The truth was, I thought about Jake constantly, not with longing or regret, but with the focused attention of someone watching a carefully laid plan come to fruition. Through various sources, I pieced together what was happening. Jake had received notice of a full tax audit, not a routine check, but a comprehensive investigation into his business practices and income reporting for the past 7 years. 7 years. That was the limit of how far back they could go for tax fraud. He'd have to provide documentation he didn't have. He'd have to explain income he hadn't reported. He'd have to justify business deductions he'd likely invented or inflated. The penalty for tax evasion in Australia isn't just about paying back what you owe. There are significant fines on top of that, plus interest on all the unpaid taxes. In serious cases, there can even be criminal prosecution. I learned that Jake had to hire a tax attorney, which cost him several $1,000s up front. The attorney would help him navigate the audit, but even the best lawyer couldn't make years of unreported income disappear. Jake would have to pay back taxes, interest, and penalties on all that cash he'd pocketed over the years. The ATO was also looking at his GST reporting, his business structure, his equipment purchases, everything. They'd requested bank statements, invoices, receipts, customer lists. For a man who deliberately avoided keeping proper records, this was a nightmare. And here's the beautiful part. Even if Jake managed to argue down some of the penalties, even if his lawyer could negotiate a slightly better deal, the process itself was devastating. Every hour he spent in meetings with his attorney was an hour he wasn't earning money. Every dollar he spent on legal fees was a dollar he didn't have for the counsel fines. Every night he spent stressed and sleepless was another night closer to a breaking point. The counsel fines had hit him hard and fast. The tax investigation was a slow bleed, a constant source of anxiety and expense that would drag on for months, maybe even years. Over the following months, I watched from a safe distance as Jake's life systematically crumbled. I was careful about how I gathered information. I didn't want anyone to suspect I was too interested, but through mutual friends, through social media accounts he didn't know I could see, through the occasional accidentally running into people who knew him, I pieced together the full picture of his downfall. The counsel fines had to be paid within 90 days or face additional penalties and potential legal action. Jake tried to fight it. He hired a lawyer who specialized in planning disputes, spent thousands on legal fees, filed appeals, but the violations were clear and well documented. The inspector had taken detailed photos, measurements, and samples. The evidence was overwhelming. He lost every appeal. The demolition order was enforced. I heard through a friend of a friend that Jake had to hire contractors to tear down the structure he'd spent tens of thousands of dollars building. The shed that was supposed to house his business, the container home that was supposed to be his future, all of it had to come down. I wish I could have seen his face when those first walls came down. All that work, all that money, all those dreams we'd built together and he'd stolen for himself, reduced to rubble and scrap metal. The property was back to bare land, but it wasn't the same as before. Now it was bare land with a record of violations attached to it. Any future buyer would discover that history. Any future building plans would face extra scrutiny. Jake had essentially devalued his own property through his arrogance and corner cutting. Then Jade left him. I heard about this from someone who knew them both. Apparently, the romance had soured quickly once reality set in. Moving into a building that was subsequently condemned and demolished wasn't exactly the romantic adventure she'd signed up for. And dating a man who was suddenly broke, stressed, and facing potential criminal tax charges, that loses its appeal fast. According to what I heard, there was a big fight. Jade accused Jake of lying to her about his financial situation. Jake blamed her for being superficial and not standing by him. It ended badly, with Jade moving out and blocking him on everything. I felt a small pang of sympathy for her. After all, she'd been lied to and manipulated just like I had. But mostly, I felt satisfied. Jake was learning that consequences don't exist in isolation. Each problem created new problems. Like dominoes falling in slow motion, the tax investigation dragged on. The ATO had calculated what they believed Jake owed based on their investigation and demanded interim payments while the audit continued. He had to liquidate assets. He sold his work van, some of his equipment, anything he could to raise cash. According to one friend, he'd even borrowed money from his brother, though that relationship was apparently strained now too, and he was living in a caravan on the property he'd once dreamed of developing. The same property where he'd stood with his arm around me, promising me a future. Now he was there alone, in a caravan, surrounded by the debris of his demolished dreams. His business suffered too. Word spread in the industry about the council violations and the tax investigation. It's a small community, panel beating, and reputation matters. Customers started questioning whether they wanted to hire someone who might not be around to honor warranties or finish jobs, someone who was potentially facing criminal charges. Jobs dried up. The few customers who did come to him haggled on price, knowing he was desperate. Jake, who'd always been so proud, so confident, was reduced to taking whatever work he could get. I heard he'd aged visibly. The stress had taken its toll. His hair had gone grayer, his face more lined. He looked, according to one person who'd seen him recently, like he'd been through a war. In a way, he had. A war with consequences. And he was losing badly. By my estimation, and believe me, I kept careful track. Here's what my revenge cost Jake. The council fines $17,000 for occupying a building without an occupancy permit, $28,000 for the unpermitted building works themselves. That's $45,000 right there. Demolition and site remediation costs, approximately $35,000. He had to pay contractors to tear everything down and remove the debris, dispose of materials properly, and restore the land to an acceptable state. Legal fees for fighting the council, at least $15,000, possibly more. And he lost anyway, so all that money was wasted. Tax attorney fees, $12,000 at minimum, and those were ongoing. Every meeting, every consultation, every piece of advice cost money. Back taxes, interest, and penalties to the ATO. This was the big one. Based on what I knew about his actual income versus what he'd likely reported, and considering the penalties and interest, I estimated at least $80,000. Possibly more, depending on how aggressive the ATO was with penalties. Then there were the indirect costs that couldn't be precisely calculated but were just as devastating. The relationship with Jade, gone. His reputation in the industry, damaged, possibly permanently. His business income, drastically reduced due to lost customers and damaged reputation. His mental health, clearly suffering based on reports of how he looked and acted. His relationship with family members who'd lent him money or tried to help, strained. The value of his property diminished due to the violation history. All told, my anonymous letters cost Jake somewhere north of $200,000 in direct costs, not counting the ongoing tax situation, lost business income, and diminished property value. And what did it cost me? 2 stamps. Maybe $10 total for supplies and postage, a few hours of research, and the immense, overwhelming satisfaction of knowing that Jake had finally faced consequences for his actions. The man who'd thought he was so clever, so above the rules, so skilled at manipulating people and systems, he'd been brought down by the truth, by his own illegal actions being exposed, by the reality that you can't cheat forever. I didn't frame him. I didn't lie. I simply made sure the right people knew what was really happening. And watching it all unfold? That was priceless. Hell yes, I feel good about it. Some people might say I went too far, that revenge is never the answer, that I should have just moved on and let karma handle it. But here's the thing, karma isn't real. Justice doesn't just happen. People like Jake, narcissists who use and discard people, who cheat the system, who think rules don't apply to them, they often get away with it. They move from victim to victim, leaving destruction in their wake, facing no real consequences. I decided to be the consequence. Jake didn't just break my heart. He wasted 4 years of my life. He made me doubt myself, question my sanity, feel small and worthless. He used my emotional investment in our shared dreams to keep me around while he prepared to replace me. He planned his exit strategy while I was still planning our future. That level of calculated cruelty deserved more than me just walking away sad. It deserved consequences that matched the harm he caused. And beyond the personal satisfaction, there's a practical element. Jake was breaking the law. He was evading taxes that fund our hospitals, schools, and roads. He was building dangerous structures in bushfire-prone areas, risking not just his own safety, but potentially that of firefighters and neighbors. He was contaminating the environment with an improper septic system. I didn't lie in my reports. I didn't fabricate evidence. I simply made sure the relevant authorities knew about crimes that were actually happening. If Jake hadn't been breaking the law, my letters would have resulted in nothing. He created the ammunition. I just made sure it was used. It's been almost a year since I executed my revenge, and I can honestly say I have no regrets. I've moved on with my life in ways I never could have while with Jake. I'm in therapy, working through the damage from those 4 years of narcissistic abuse. I've reconnected with friends I drifted from. I've even started dating again, though I'm taking it slow and keeping my standards high. Meanwhile, Jake is still dealing with the fallout. The ATO investigation is ongoing. He's still paying off fines. His business is struggling. And according to the last update I heard, he's bitter and angry, blaming everyone but himself for his problems. That's the narcissist way, isn't it? Never taking responsibility, always the victim. The world is just so unfair to poor Jake. Except it's not unfair, it's justice. Finally. So do I think he deserved it? Drop comments like, do share and subscribe.